Thank you, Dr.Sriprapha, and thank you particularly for promoting me to director.
Oh, sorry. You should have been director.
So welcome everyone to this launch of this advocacy report on the human rights of stateless Rohingya in Thailand. This is a joint publication of the Equal Rights Trust, my organization, which is based in London, and the Institute for Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahidol University. We've been very lucky to be able to collaborate with Dr.Sriprapha and her team on this project. I want to very quickly take you through three topics and then focus our attention on the much more interesting and important speakers to follow. What I will do first is tell you a little bit about the project that ERT and Mahidol University and our other partners have been working on, and give you some sort of context of what we intend to do with this project, of which this is a publication. I will then speak of some of the regional challenges and themes and issues which I think are important to contextualize the Rohingya issue and help focus our attention on the situation in Thailand. And finally, and very briefly, I will speak about some of the challenges that we identified which are specific to Thailand. Some of them are also common to other countries, and some of the recommendations we made in this regard. So the Equal Rights Trust is a small London-based organization that approaches human rights issues from an equality and non-discrimination perspective. And we've been working on statelessness since 2008. We see statelessness as an issue which is very relevant to discrimination. We see it as an issue which is often caused by discrimination. And we also see that statelessness has many discriminatory consequences as well. And the Rohingya issue is a perfect case in point in this regard. For those of you who may not be aware, the Rohingya were made stateless through a discriminatory law in Myanmar in 1982, which on the basis of their ethnicity denationalized them. As a result of their stateless status in Myanmar, they have been subject to severe human rights restrictions, abuses, and persecution over many decades. These include restrictions on their freedom of movement, even within the North Rakhine state where the majority of Rohingya live. They include restrictions on their right to marry. They include the imposition of arbitrary taxes, forced labor, land grabs, and the list goes on. In addition to this systematic and prolonged discrimination and exclusion, we've seen recently in 2012 a very serious bout of violence against the Rohingya, repeated in October, repeated again in 2013, and most recently in January this year. Now, some people, because of the heightened media attention that this violence has caused, assume that the Rohingya and their persecution is very much rooted in 2012. But if you look back in history, we see similar acts of persecution and mass violence happening in 1978, happening in 1991-92, and we see the 2012 and post-2012 scenario as part of a pattern of very violent acts interspersed with more periodic and systematic discrimination that the Rohingya have faced over many decades. Now, our project that we are doing with Mahidol University aims to address the human rights of the Rohingya from a regional perspective. So we are focusing on Myanmar. We are also focusing on Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Thailand. And we are even doing some research in Saudi Arabia. And the reason we think this is important is because, A, the issue has a regional impact. The forced migration of the Rohingya has made this an issue of concern for various countries around the region. And B, as a result of this regional impact, all countries which have long-term Rohingya populations have an individual responsibility to protect those populations and also a shared responsibility to do so. And we feel that the failure to embrace both this individual and this shared responsibility has further disadvantaged the Rohingya. Whilst today's report, the report that's being launched today is about the situation in Thailand, we are very conscious that our intention is not to point the finger at Thailand alone. that would be a mistake. I think we need to acknowledge the challenges that Thailand faces, acknowledge the challenges that other countries face, but also hold them to the very high and difficult standards of international human rights law, which these countries, as an expression of their national sovereignty, have acceded to. And we, as a result, I think we have an expectation that the Rohingya will receive protection in these countries. Very quickly on the regional challenges, I will just pick out two. One important one, I think, is the protracted statelessness of the Rohingya. And the importance of this challenge is that it's not just Rohingya who are recent migrants who face discrimination in these countries, it's also Rohingya who are born in these countries. And with those who have recently migrated to Thailand or Bangladesh or Malaysia, escaping persecution, I think it's quite straightforward to acknowledge that the root of the problem lies in Myanmar. With those born in these countries, it's not as straightforward. So where does the responsibility lie with regard to a child born in a particular country who is stateless in that country and as a result does not benefit from basic human rights protection? That's a difficult question. The international legal answer for that question is not as straightforward as perhaps we may think, but there's a very general thrust of that answer which suggests that the country in which the child is born has a significant responsibility towards that child. Whether that responsibility extends to the actual provision of nationality to that child is a matter of question, but it definitely does extend to the registration of births. It definitely does extend to the provision of healthcare, education, legal stay rights, etc. The second key challenge that I want to address is this notion of a pull factor, which is one of the reasons why I think we are in this kind of stalemate, where many countries are not doing anything to address the situation of the Rohingya. I think this is a legitimate concern, and anyone who is seriously engaging on the issue and seriously trying to push for the human rights protection of the Rohingya needs to have a good, solid answer to this question, and an answer that takes into consideration the concerns of states. I have, I think, three answers to this question. And the first is that if states acknowledge that there is a shared responsibility, and if states coordinate their protection efforts, that diminishes the whole impact of a pull factor. So for example, if Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Thailand all grant Rohingya the right to work and the right to education, then having education in one of these countries will not draw Rohingya to them. The second thing which I think is equally important to acknowledge is that Rohingya who flee persecution are fleeing for their lives. They are fleeing in order to be able to live as human beings and just have a chance at a life that you and I take for granted. So there is no real pull factor involved here, there is a push factor involved. And unless we acknowledge that as long as the situation in Myanmar is bad for the Rohingya, both in terms of legal structures and in terms of the kind of violence they face and the impunity with which such violence is conducted, Rohingya migration flows from Myanmar are not going to end. And I think here there's an incentive as a result for these states which have significant Rohingya populations to also use their diplomatic channels to assert some kind of pressure on Myanmar to get its act together. And perhaps this is something that we can see more of. The third very quick point I want to make on the pull factor is that when people speak of the challenge that a pull factor imposes on a state, what is often ignored or not said is the difficulties and challenges difficulties and challenges associated with nothing being done about the situation. So if a pull factor creates certain challenges, what are the challenges of leaving the status quo as it is? The human impact on the Rohingya is very evident, and the fact that this is by allowing the status quo to continue, states are not fulfilling their international obligations is also evident. I think a third point is that this also has an impact on states. It has an impact on their reputations with regard to the international community. It perhaps has an impact on stability and security within the states, because what is happening is over multiple generations, we have growing populations that are disenfranchised, that are uneducated, that don't have access to healthcare, and this cannot be a good thing. Now, before I conclude, I would like to briefly talk about the report and some of the issues that it addresses. By no means do we assume that this is a comprehensive report on the Rohingya. We just picked out a few issues which we think are particularly relevant, and also where we feel that perhaps there is some scope for progress. So we've spoken in this report about the detention and deportation and the right to liberty of Rohingya. We've spoken about the rights of Rohingya children and about the right to work and related vulnerabilities. And when speaking of these three issues in the Thai context, what is evident is that at the international level, Thailand has ratified most of the relevant treaties from a human rights perspective. It has not ratified the refugee and statelessness treaties, but many of the rights that flow from international human rights law are relevant to the Rohingya in the context of these three clusters of rights. Similarly, Thailand's national legal framework is equipped to deal with issues under these rights, under these clusters of rights. So, for example, there is provision under Thai law for universal birth registration. There is provision for access to education for all and access to healthcare. But for some reason, the Rohingya do not benefit from this. So we think that there is a gap here that can be addressed with political will. And our efforts in terms of our joint advocacy over the next few years would be to engage with the Thai government to see if within the existing legal framework, it would be possible to create a situation which allows a greater protection of the Rohingya. We also feel that there are some areas where the legal framework can actually further improve, but we acknowledge that in that context, it's perhaps a longer road and a road that we are committed to stay on, but that will take time. So we are seeing this in a very pragmatic way as issues that we may be able to get some traction in the short to mid-term, as well as other issues that we need to keep on the table in terms of the long term. And we see this report very much as a start to that process. And hopefully, if ever we have an event here 3 years down the line with another report, we may be able to tell you of a slightly improved situation. Thank you.